Well, if you're just joining us, we've been talking this week about what Paul meant when he said a husband should love his wife, and really kind of investigating this word love, this thing that is one of the primary characteristics of the nature of God. He really says if we are followers of God, that it's going to be one of the primary characteristics of a man's relationship with his wife. And Paul is not implying that women shouldn't love their husbands. As I pointed out last week, it's just easier for a man to respect his wife than it is for him to show her that kind of sacrificial loving. And it's easier for a woman to sacrificially love her husband than it is sometimes to really respect him. And so you find that dynamic where wives will say, well, I love him, but I just don't respect him. Well, it doesn't work that way. And the reason that Paul emphasized that difference between men and women is because he knew it was easier for a woman to love her husband than it was for her to respect him. And so he said, you need to focus on respecting your husband and not holding him in any kind of contempt. Similarly, he says to husbands, it's easy for you to respect your wife as the mother of your children and so forth, but what's most important is if you want to really show her respect, you'll show her that you love her sacrificially the way Christ loves his church. Now, yesterday I talked a little bit about what that began to look like, this word agape in the Greek, and it starts off, as we said, with the idea of appreciation. I see that there's a complementary dynamic in my relationship where my wife adds valuable things to me and my opportunities to add value to her. And he goes on, we'll get into further on this gentleman, how we can practically do that. But the second thing is, the second word that really is put in the lexicon to describe this agape love is the idea of regard. And the word regard means to show somebody attention or concern. And literally it means to gaze at. Now, Peter said something really interesting in 1 Peter 3:7. He says that a man should dwell with his wife according to knowledge. In other words, he's saying for a man to live with his wife, he needs to know her. And that's part of the objective, coming to know your spouse, kind of to figure out, what makes them tick. And I found over the years, my wife and I have spent, I don't know how many hours, too many to count, right? But we've spent so many hours talking about our own childhood and our own experience with our mothers and dads, because moms and dads are critical formers of who we are. And as much as you may dislike to admit that, it's the formation of who you are came a lot through observing your parents the first 12 years of your life. That's before we reach puberty and before we go through this, what we call differentiation, where suddenly you see yourself separate from mom and dad and you begin to have your own ideas and think your own thoughts. And one of those thoughts is that you look at your parents and say, well, I'll never be like them. And lo and behold, I found that when I became adult and became a father and a husband, I was like my dad in a lot of ways that weren't necessarily good. One of the things I got from my dad was really good, was he's intensely generous and intensely loyal, but at the same time, he's also a workaholic and at times a rageaholic. So, these things are things that we have to confront, we have to deal with and recognize. And our spouses oftentimes are the sounding board, the one who helps us to see these things in ourselves. And so it becomes important that we pay attention, we gaze at one another, focus upon them. It's an interesting concept in psychology. We call it the significant other. And the idea behind it is that whoever you focus on, for good or evil, you will become an imitator of. In other words, if you hate somebody and you can't let go of how much you hate them, over time you will become like them. It's a crazy thing, but they kind of imprint themselves in a negative way upon our brains. That's why Paul later would say in Philippians 4, he says, if there's anything good and lovely and true and of merit and so forth, he says, think on these things. Don't think about all the ugly things that are out there. And I say this particularly to those of you who are locked into the evening news. I don't care which side of the spectrum you're listening. There's just this negativity that flows out, and I have to balance myself. I mean, I get enough information to kind of see what's going on, but I don't want to linger there. If you sit there all night listening to news programs, you're going to become an angry, bitter person. What you need to do is focus upon things that are positive, like in the Word, and really striving to be an example of what is right, and not somebody who can expose what is wrong. We're not called to go around exposing the world of how bad it is. God says He'll do that. but we're basically primarily supposed to be examples of what is right. And that example itself will expose things that are wrong. So if you feel like your wife isn't loving and affectionate enough, you have to realize, how loving and affectionate am I? How much regard do I give to her and her needs? How willing am I to conform myself to things that would make her happy and avoid those things that make her unhappy? So that's kind of a basic thing when he talks about how you need to have this regard for this other person, that they are in your purview. And this again is really challenging in our day and age, because not only do we find oftentimes that careers take husband and wives in completely different directions, even if the husband has a career outside of the home and the mother's career is in the home, especially raising the kids. It's just as valid, just as important, maybe more important, because the old adage that says, she who rocks the cradle rules the world. Great book that really underlines that and proves it historically is called Mother's Leadership and Success by Guy Odom. And it's a great book if you can find it. It's out of print now, but I think you can still get it. But may not be cheap, but it's such a great book that illustrates the influence that mothers have in raising kids. So we shouldn't, again, when we talk about appreciating the roles that each have, husbands really need to appreciate the role that mothers have in raising their kids, and we need to regard them in that regard. So that I used to tell guys, don't get off work until you've been home an hour. And what I meant by that is, I saw it myself. You go out and you work all day, you're exhausted, you've been dealing with all sorts of baloney coming your way from all sorts of ugly things. You had to fight through traffic to get home, because one of the things we realize is we're the only one who knows how to drive. And when we finally get in the house, we walk in and your attitude is, don't bother me, just I want to sit down, read the paper, turn on the TV, get on the internet. I don't want to deal with anything. I just want peace and quiet. That's a pretty selfish response, quite honestly, because if your boss had said, I want you to stay an hour longer to finish this project, you'd go, okay, and you'd stay and you'd do it with the right attitude in most cases. Well, you kind of have to have that attitude when you come home, that you realize that the wife has been pulling heavy duty all day long, and when you get home, you should be, tuned into that and be there to help. How can you help her to prepare the dinner, to take care of the kids, to get them ready for bed, and all those kind of things, baths and readings and stories and all the things that go into caring for kids? You need to recognize that she can't take a break until all of that is done, and so you can't either. And I think what you'll find is, over time, not only will you find that to be a healthy break from your daily projects, but also a refreshing time, and an appreciation will be there on her part. She'll have a high regard for you. So if we're going to have a loving relationship, there has to be this dynamic of really gazing at one another and studying with one another and knowing one another well enough that we can be a helper of their joy and really help them to grow in their faith. So I'm going to cut it off here. We're going to continue again talking about the third and the fourth characteristics as we finish out the week on what it actually means to love another person. God bless you and go in His grace.